We start with the film's narrator telling us how society is now stalled, because where we once favoured traits possessed by noblemen who thus reproduced well, today we worship celebrity culture whilst favouring fake tits and silicone arses, and are now producing mogadons like Joey Essex or Honey Boo Boo. And with no natural predators to thin the herd, nature is simply rewarding those who reproduce the most, regardless of possessing any beneficial traits like intelligence or having more than 5 teeth, as evidenced by any episode of Jeremy Kyle ever made.
Damn!
Anyway, after an intro that seems to imply the advocacy of some kind of social engineering agenda that inevitably leaves a sour taste of eugenics in one's mouth, we meet Joe Bowers, played here by Owen Wilson's little bro, who in this film is a simple army librarian with an enviable job which consists of sitting around on his arse and watching TV all day. Suddenly, his boss walks in and tells him he's totally getting replaced for a new assignment, but Joey Boy doesn't want to leave because it's a job that even he can't screw up, and if he just stays another 8 years then he gets his pension and is set for life. Man, I hope this selfish entitlement isn't the attitude of everyone in the military. Anyway, he's then led off upstairs as we cut to a top secret briefing being presented by Dr. Collins, who tells us that our hero Joe is apparently the most average man to ever walk the face of the earth. Well, second behind Sam Worthington at least. The military guy then confirms that the protagonist has no family or friends or anyone to miss him, and so is a perfect candidate for this mysterious program. And because this is 2005 and before the era of progressivism, there's no women in the army suitable to join the experiment, and so he had to go to the private sector to get that bridesmaid's bird who cosplays as Kamala Harris on SNL every Saturday, who is here playing a deceptive degenerate who gets more successful in her job just by shagging around. So I guess this film was where she drew inspiration from to portray the current VP so well. Suddenly though, the military top brass cut short Colin's presentation, where he was about to go through all the ways that he earned the trust of the hooker's pimp called Upgrade, including going to the club for drinks and smacking a bitch up for 70% of her whoring. But they just tell him to get on with it, and so he has to skip through another dozen slides of his once good character slowly devolving into some kind of low-life criminal, which is kind of like watching the real-life career of Ezra Miller, but in slideshow form. Anyway, the plan is to place the subjects into a dry freeze hibernation pod for exactly 1 year, to test out if humans can be preserved indefinitely. Though they could have just done this experiment for free just by tracking Katie Price's endless plastic surgeries and shit.
LOL!
The next morning, Owen Wilson's little bro is chatting to Kamala Harris, aka Rita, and who totally doesn't get that she's talking about whoring when she says her job involves a little of this and a little of that, and assumes by looking at her that she's just some kind of painter. Not a joke. They then get in the pods, but the hooker weirdly gets anxious about being locked in a dark coffin for 365 days. But the doctor bloke walks in and just randomly drops the N-word, because comedy, bro. And they're both put to sleep to start the procedure. Although it was only supposed to be a year, Collins is promptly arrested for going native whilst on an undercover sting operation and totally becoming a bona fide pimp. Thus, the top secret military base is instantly demolished without removing them from their pods because reasons. And the narrator explains how humans only got stupider as the centuries went by. Mostly because the population exploded and doctors were too busy trying to treat baldies and prolonged boners. Again, not a joke. Naturally, the populace became imbeciles and would leave their trash stacked in a pile until it overflowed and caused all sorts of problems. God, thank God this movie is just satire. Now in 2505, there's a huge trash avalanche, and our hero's pod comes sweeping into the living room of a guy glued to a giant screen. And he's scoffing a tub of lard whilst watching a hilarious programme where a soy boy gets his manhood beaten every night, which I'm assuming is meant to be a 2005 parody of Jackass, but could also be a current day satire of a Prince Harry and Meghan Markle documentary show.
LOL!
Anyway, this guy is called Frito, and he doesn't seem to be bothered by Owen Wilson's little bro randomly appearing in his living room on a landslide of trash, and mumbles one-word guttural insults at him for daring to interrupt today's episode of Ow, My Balls. After being defenestrated by a Mogadon, Joe wanders the streets of what was once Washington DC, dazed and confused and not knowing what year it was. And there seems to be homeless people everywhere and crap all over the streets, so to be fair, he's probably just a bit baffled as to how on earth he got all the way over to current day Cali. The narrator, however, tells us that although he can understand other people, they can't comprehend him, as when he speaks he sounds, quote, pompous and faggy to them. Or in other words, exactly like Keir Starmer.
My dad was a tall.
So he tries a local hospital where people are shuffling around like zombies, as a receptionist struggles to choose which button best correlates to his symptoms, and eventually just chooses the pink one about amnesia and goes back to watching a video of paint drying on a computer screen. Anyway, he goes to see the doctor, which here is just a giant machine that tells you the very basics of what could be wrong with you via 3 tubes that go in your ear, mouth and anus hole. But the nurse hilariously mixes them up by accident and expects him to put the shitty tube in his gob because again, comedy bro. Turns out that was just a triage section and the real doctor was Justin Long all along. And after freaking out because of his lack of a barcode on his wrist, he hits an alarm and says it's unscannable, as Joe finds out that he's travelled 500 years into the future only to find that Justin Long is still around.
No!
Exploring his new surroundings, Joe sees unfriendly people everywhere and billboards what straight up insult you. So although he's freaked out, it kind of feels like he's never really been away from New York. The narrator then says that the economy is in deep decline, a dust bowl has ravaged food stocks, and the current #1 movie is simply called Arse, which was literally just a pic of an arse on screen for 90 minutes. Man, I'm not sure I could take watching an hour and a half of Piers Morgan, let alone pay for it. Anyway, after coming across a woman who is conned out of fries by a fast food machine and somehow ends up having her kids taken away for being too poor, Joe gets arrested for not having a tattoo or paying his hospital bill, and he just can't believe that he's now represented in court by that Mogadon who lobbed him out of a window earlier. The prosecution reckon he's totally guilty just by looking at him, whilst his own legal rep agrees, mostly because he talks like a British cigarette. Turns out in this version of America there's no true democracy, and it's just one giant kangaroo court where guilt is decided based on public opinion and mob pressure. Again, thank the Lord that this is all just fictional satire. Hilariously, his lawyer then adds his own charges to his client for mucking up his apartment and interrupting his episode of Ow My Balls, so naturally, he's found guilty and receives a stiff sentence. Meanwhile, Rita has awakened and rakes in a few $100 by making a misogynist Latino pervert wait by a phone for 2 days. Joe then gets taken to get his tattoo done and is made to stick his arm into a deep dark crack. And I can totally relate. Last time I did that, I also got a black mark on my wrist at the end of it, but yeah, that's a whole different story. Anyway, he somehow ends up confirming his name is not Shaw, and then undergoes the world's easiest aptitude test since deciding whether to watch Is It a Cake or Is It in Fact Not a Cake over on the Netflix. So he's soon taken to jail where he literally goes up to a guard and just asks to be let out. Later, he goes back to see that Mogadon lawyer guy who says there's totally a time machine knocking about, and in order to get him to show him the way, Joe almost breaks Frito's little brain trying to get him to understand basic maths to comprehend the value of the bribes he's offering. Suddenly though, the Popo arrive at the door, and Frito runs off with Owen Wilson's little bro whilst constantly saying he likes money. Joe then picks up Rita from a random street and loses the cops by driving into a dust bowl, though his arm somehow gets scanned on the way, and because they listen to leftist eco-warriors and bought an electric car, their vehicle is remotely disabled and are totally screwed when the local filth turn off the battery for disobeying them. A little later, and after reciting the story of my life about never getting a handjob in Starbucks, they find themselves in a desert, where they go to the world's biggest Costco's, and shockingly, every commercial chain also offers sexual release with every product and service. Which I really hope they introduce in our world, because I'd really love to get a blowy every time I file my tax return early. Bruh. Anyway, after simulating sex and dry hump in the air, another alarm goes off, and Joe and Frito are chased onto the subway by the cops, and with Rita out in the bathroom, Joe gets so caught up in explaining time travel to himself that the subway leaves with a bewildered Frito on board, and so he's once again captured by the fuzz. But luckily, instead of going back to the big house, he ends up outside of the White House as a result of his extraordinary IQ test, which officially made him the smartest man in the literal world. Yes, even smarter than Oscar Isaac. There he meets the highest levels of the current administration, including the Secretary of Energy, who is a teenage contest winner for the prize of being a cabinet member, and the Secretary of State brought to us by Carl's Jr.
What?
Hilariously, the Secretary of Defence is just a fat guy who makes loud noises, whilst the Attorney General is a woman with huge norks. And the Education Sec is just some pedo-looking fella groping some balls. Which sounds about right for public school teachers these days. Anyway, they want Joey Boy to be Secretary of the Interior, but before you can say, Owen Wilson would be a lot funnier, the bleeding president bursts in, who turns out to be a 5-time SmackDown champion wrestler, which does strain credulity a bit. I mean, a brash TV entertainer with a dark tan becoming leader of the free world? Well, there's satire, and then there's just silly nonsense. So the president calls a press conference thing and says he's totally got a plan to fix everything, which mainly involves just wheeling out Owen Wilson's little bro and doing a real life version of that do something meme. He then promises the public that this Joe bloke is going to fix everything in 1 week, so naturally, Joe plays along on the promise of a full presidential pardon, and has Frito brought to the White House to tell him how to get to the time machine thing so he can go home already. But said Frito fella just mocks his faggy voice, whilst the guard momentarily thinks there's 2 of them. Anyway, Joe asks his crack team of secretaries in the cabinet to find Rita and bring her on board so that they can utilise her, but they all think that means butt-fucking and descend into immature hysterics. Joe then focuses on the failed crops, which at this point look drier than a nun's clunge, before Rita is finally brought over and they then head over to the bushes to read Frito's map to the time machine. Unfortunately, it's less intelligible than a Joe Biden speech, and much like the current president, it's fuck all use to anyone. So they turn their attention back to the crops, and soon realise that these dopes have been spraying the field with the equivalent of fucking Gatorade. Because Brawndo the Thirst Mutilator totally has electrolytes, which is what plants crave apparently. Turns out they also crave water, hence why there's less natural shoots sprouting up in that field than there are on Bruce Willis's scalp. Joe then sets about trying to convince these Muppets to follow basic botanical procedure. But when that doesn't work out, he just tells them that he can talk to plants, and they say they could really do with a drop of water, even if it's out of a toilet bowl. Later that evening, Joe and Rita have a nice talk about how Einstein probably thought that everyone around him were a bunch of tards too, and hence why he went totally nuts and kept sticking his tongue out at people before trying to build a giant fuck-off bomb and shit. Whilst Joe mugs himself off by saying her boyfriend Upgrade will probably be upset if his prostitute girlfriend shared a bed with another man, so he just kips on the floor like a riot cack. The next morning, they're woken up by rocks flying through their window, and for a minute, Joe thinks he's finally back home, but turns out they aren't actually back in Portland yet, and it's totally not just a normal Tuesday being terrorised by an Antifa mob.
Fuck you!
But it's in fact a bunch of angry workers who have been laid off when stocks fell as a result of him making the government switch to water over the Brawndo Thirst Mutilator stuff. And because half the country is employed by the Brawndo company, everyone blames Owen Wilson's little bro for making them all unemployed. And Joe quickly finds himself back in jail, though this time chained to a big rock so he can't outsmart them by saying he doesn't belong there and just leave again. Joe and the giant rock are then sentenced to 1 night rehabilitation, which consists of large-scale monster trucks running some fuckers over, whilst the audience cheers on straight-up gory murder like a sporting event. Luckily though, he gets a car to defend himself with, which turns out to be a battered-up banger with a giant floppy dildo on the front. Back at the White House, Rita looks out the window and sees a small flower blooming out of the soil, so Frito drives them over to the rehabilitation arena to try and stop Owen Wilson's little bro being screwed to death by the fearsome dildozer and Beef Supreme. Luckily, Beef Supreme seems to die without ever getting out of the gate, and Rita then tries to convince the president to stop all this killing because she found a flower and thought it was pretty, before Joe then beats the fearsome drill dozers by getting them to smash into and drill each other. Suddenly though, Beef Supreme climbs out from under the rocks with a giant fuck-off flamethrower what's paired with some sort of grenade launcher, who then tries to blow Owen Wilson's little bro to Kingdom Come. Whilst elsewhere, Rita sends Frito and a random cameraman on a side quest to go check out if any other flowers are blooming in the crop field, but naturally, they get distracted by half-price handjobs at Starbucks. Meanwhile, Joe grabs a microphone and insists that putting water on the plants will defo work, bro, and that trying to blow up the one person trying to help them is probably not the smartest idea. But given they're all mogadons anyway, they don't really give a shit and just want to see the poncy guy who talks like a British cigarette burn already. Back at the crop field, Frito and the random cameraman exit the Starbucks having had their coffee beans well and truly strained, before they get into a punch-up, which leads to the camera conveniently landing right in front of the newborn Blance. Everyone in the arena now sees that Owen Wilson's little bro was totally right, and the president saves his ass from being torched at the hands of Beef Supreme, who incidentally seems to be played by another Wilson brother, and thereby earning himself a presidential pardon. Huzzah! Later that night, and everyone's celebrating, as Joe says he's going to miss these nutters after he totally goes back to his own era in that totally real time machine thing. Rita, though, is staying put, because her pimp upgrade isn't around to take 70% of her whoring profits, and also, people here give her free money for just standing around on street corners and not having to have to suck off dirty hobos for $5 an hour. Nobody, though, quite wants Joe to leave, because then they would have to do all that thinking and shit. So our hero soon decides to screw that time machine thing, because everyone will likely die off if he leaves, and also because it turns out that the time machine thing was totally just a phony fakey amusement ride, complete with dodgy and ludicrous retellings of history. Like how the UN unnazified the world using dinosaurs to defeat Charlie Chaplin, and how Joe Biden got 81 million votes. I mean, how Joey B legitimately became the most popular president of all time. And we end with a narrator telling us how Owen Wilson's little bro is now president, Frito is VP, and Rita is his first lady. And the pair now have 3 kids who are the smartest kids in all the world, whilst Frito has 32 dumb kids with 8 wives. So, just your average Mormon family then. I'm joking. Mormons have more than 8 wives. Anyway, that's it. That's the movie. Though my favourite part was the post-credit sequence, where relentless pimp Upgrade gets out of a cryopod whilst vowing to, quote, find this hoe. Which is what I also vow every time I go to the garden store to replace my busted up garden tool every spring. But anyway, that's the plot and that's your lot, considering that bell thing so you don't miss any future recaps. Say hello in the comments if you have time, and I'll see you in the next one.